Well, I especially want to thank Dr. Tom Cavanaugh and the philosophy department here at the University of San Francisco. George, for your help. Amir, who did not get recognition, who is also part of the philosophy club here, put a lot of hours in. For those of you who've put on events like this, you know what sort of work it takes to pull off something this grand, and they should be commended for their hard work. And it's hopefully something that we can replicate and bring back again here at the University of San Francisco at some point in the future. Well, as George mentioned, I am with the Intercollegiate Studies Institute, and this is Cicero's Podium. Cicero's Podium is a formal debate series that travels the country in an attempt to bring civil and informed discussion about perennial and current topics to students all over the country. The Cicero's Podium debate series, the vision for the series was forged by the creative energy of Arthur N. Roop, and Art Roop is based in Southern California in Santa Barbara. And with the success of this program, we have achieved the ability to have further funding for the program, and we are excited tonight to have with us somebody who is now contributing in a serious way to this debate program, Mr. Arthur Sioka. And Mr. Arthur Sioka is in the front row, and we should congratulate him for helping to support the series as well. Like Mr. Roop and Mr. Sioka, they are motivated by the exploration of ideas and the exploration of truth. And the purpose tonight is to not humiliate or denigrate, but to elevate and thoroughly examine a socially important topic that affects us all, the prohibition or legalization of drugs in America. If you'd like to learn more about this series, and we do 12 of them every year, please visit isi.org, where you can download them for free and view them at your leisure. Now let's get on with it. Our debaters tonight, first on my left is Dr. Jame Q. Wilson. He has enjoyed a long and storied career in the public policy arena. He has taught political science at Harvard University and was the James Collin Professor of Management and Public Policy at UCLA from 1985 to 1997. He is the author or co-author of 14 books, the most recent of which are The Marriage Problem, How Our Culture Has Weakened Families, Moral Judgment and the Moral Sense. His others include American Government, Bureaucracy, Thinking About Crime, Varieties of Police Behavior, Political Organizations, and Crime and Human Nature. In addition, he has edited or contributed books on urban problems, government regulation of business, and the prevention of delinquency among children. Many of his writings on morality and human character have been collected On Character, Essays by Jame Q. Wilson, which is available in the back of the room. His textbook on American government is more widely used on university campuses than any other government textbook. Dr. Wilson has served on a number of national commissions concerned with public policy. He was chairman of the White House Task Force on Crime, chairman of the National Advisory Commission on Drug Abuse Prevention, a member of the Attorney General's Task Force on Violent Crime, a member of the President's Foreign Intelligence Advisory Board, and a member of the directors of the Police Foundation Forum. He is currently chairman of the Board of Academic Advisors of the American Electrical System, State Farm Mutual Insurance Company, and Protection One. He is also a trustee of the RAND Corporation. On my right, Mr. Ethan Nadelmann. He is the founder of the Drug Policy Alliance, the leading organization in the United States promoting alternatives to the war on drugs. Mr. Nadelmann was born in New York City and received his BA, JD, and PhD from Harvard and a master's degree in international relations from the London School of Economics. He then taught politics and public affairs at Princeton University from 1987 to 1994, where his speaking and writings on drug policy in publications ranging from Science and Foreign Affairs to American Heritage and National Review attracted international attention. He also authored the books Cops Across Borders, the first scholarly study of the internationalization of U.S. criminal law enforcement, a new book co-authored with Peter Andreas and entitled Policing the Globe, Criminalization and Crime Control in International Relations, was published by Oxford University Press in 2006. In 1994, Mr. Nadelmann founded the Lynn Smith Center, a drug policy institute created with the philanthropic support of George Soros. In 2000, the growing center merged with another organization to form the Drug Policy Alliance, which advocates for drug policies grounded in science, compassion, health, and human rights. Described by Rolling Stones magazine as the point man for drug policy reforms, Mr. Nadelmann is widely regarded as the most prominent proponent of drug policy reform. And as I just learned at dinner, he's now a star on YouTube because he has been on the Colbert Report. So, tonight's debate will follow a modified intercollegiate debate format. It'll be 90 minutes long. Each participant will provide an opening statement, engage in a series of rebuttals, have a chance to ask each other a question, and then provide a closing statement. We will have ample time for questions. The Q&A mic is over here to the left of the corner of the room. I would ask that in preparation for that period, and it's a very important part of this program, and we want you to ask questions, but we want you to prepare them, and we want them to be directed, and we want them to be succinct. We will not tolerate folks giving their own personal manifestos and political declarations. Just ask and direct your questions to one of the debaters. So starting us off tonight in the affirmative is Mr. Ethan Nadelmann.
Thank you very much, and thank you to the Institute and to the University of San Francisco for hosting this debate and bringing me back, actually, with an old professor of mine, James Q. Wilson, from my undergraduate and early graduate school days. The debate reminds me a bit of the days when I first got involved in this in the late 1980s, and there were lots of debates about legalization versus not legalization. And I found that those things, they were lively, they were important. I'm not sure. I thought that I won most of them. But it's not sure that really made much of a difference. And part of the reason I don't think it made much of a difference was because the debate was so much in the abstract. What was legalization really going to be? How do we even envision it? How do we imagine it? And then, quite frankly, how did you get there? How did you get there? Here we were in the midst of the drug war, the late 1980s, early 1990s, and how are we going to go to radical legalization? And I would give speeches or debates and talk about, well, we have to focus on the problems of prohibition and blah, 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 and we should think about this, and why are we so afraid of legalization? Perhaps, I don't know if it's the right answer, but perhaps it is. Some people would be spun around and persuaded. I never thought about it that way. And then they go back home, and there would be the $1 billion a year anti-drug ad campaigns, and there would be the president on TV holding up a bag of cocaine, and there would be the drug war and the drug war and the drug war. And I found in many respects it was oftentimes a somewhat futile debate. That when people talked about what legalization would mean, they were oftentimes reduced to caricatures, imagining what if we legalized crack cocaine, but nothing else? Or what if we legalized that without thinking about it in the broader context? Arguments that were oftentimes ahistorical. And I know that from my side, from the argument that was often identified as pro-legalization, some of this was grounded in pure ideology. I mean, one of my great allies in all of this was Milton Friedman, the famous Nobel Prize-winning economist at Chicago and the Hoover Institution. And he would give impassioned critiques of drug prohibition and impassioned defenses of drug legalization, and he and I would be close to one another, but then he would jibe me for being too moderate, not going far enough. So what I want to do is to engage this issue, not with a sort of going back 17 years or whatever to the old style thing, but starting from where I am living and working and breathing today. You know, I left Princeton back in '94, 13 years ago, because I had an opportunity to try to transform some of these ideas into action, to try changing the way we deal with drugs in this country. There were the opportunities to put together the ballot initiatives that legalized medical marijuana, Prop 215 in California in 1996 and in many other states. There were the opportunities to advance the treatment instead of incarceration initiative, Prop 36, that has probably been the most significant piece of sentencing reform in American history since the repeal of alcohol prohibition. There were the opportunities to try to reduce the spread of HIV/AIDS and Hep C by making clean needle programs available, expanding access to quality drug treatment, promoting more sensible drug education in the schools, trying to prevent overdose fatalities. It was the nitty-gritty. And I have to say, although oftentimes I'm frustrated because so much of this nitty-gritty work has to do with somehow working within a prohibitionist system that I see as fundamentally malignant, fundamentally grounded in suppositions about human nature and individual freedom, which I find abhorrent or at least disagreeable, that nonetheless real change is going to come about that way. So I have to say at the beginning here that wherever you come out, if you believe in the end that the war on drugs is wrong, if you believe that the system of punitive drug prohibition, that is the way we deal with drugs in this country, is wrong, then do something about it. Get active. Pick those materials up off the desk so I don't have to take them back to the office with me. A sign-up sheet will go around later. Sign up and get active and get organized. You know, the question I want to ask all of you right here is, how many of you know somebody who's been arrested or spent time in jail or prison because of a drug charge? Just raise your hands. How many of you really thought they deserved to go there? Raise your hands. Some of you. Most of you not. Let's face it, some people do deserve to go to prison. Let me ask you another question. How many of you know somebody who's struggled, close in your family, a very close friend who struggled with a drug addiction problem? Raise your hands. How many of you believe that prison is the right answer for that person? Not very many of you. And close your eyes, please, for a second. How many of you have ever used marijuana? Raise your hand. How many of you believe that you're criminals for doing so? One. Thank you. Take them away. So what I'm fighting for here is a more sensible and compassionate way of dealing with drugs in our country and around the world. And I'll come at the end to what I mean by legalization and where I am on that issue, but it will grow and emerge from the analysis I'm going to give you now. You know, when we talk about building a drug policy in this country and the world grounded in science, compassion, health, and human rights, that's what we're fighting for. Science, compassion, health, and human rights. We're trying to find ways of dealing with drugs and the people who use them and sell them and make them what have you in ways that are consistent with our basic values. I start off with the supposition that there's always going to be drugs. We're never going to be a drug-free society. In fact, there never has been a drugs-free society in the history of human civilization, so far as we know. The possible exception of the Eskimos, because they couldn't grow anything. But apart from them, right, there hasn't. And therefore, the challenge, it seems to me, is not how do we get rid of drugs, not how do we build a moat between ourselves and drugs, between our children and drugs and schools and drugs. That's not the challenge, because that's an impossible challenge. The challenge instead is how do we learn how to live with drugs in such a way that they cause the least possible harm and the greatest possible good. When Congress, in all its wisdom, in 1988 passed a resolution declaring that America would be drug-free by 1995, you had to ask, what were they smoking? And it wasn't what you've been smoking, I'll tell you that. When the UN gathered for a giant international anti-drug assembly in 1980 and proclaimed a drug-free world, we can do it. Why did they bother? Who were they joking? Who were they teasing? What measure of credibility did they believe that they would have with citizens or with children anywhere around the world? Yet that objective, which is written on the front page of the National Institute on Drug Abuse, a supposedly scientific agency, that objective, creating a drug-free America, that objective, which I believe is in many respects a fundamentally totalitarian objective, because the only way to get there is to create a totalitarian society in which all human beings are effectively tested and punished for putting certain forbidden products into their bodies. So I assume we have to find ways to do two things. The first one is to reduce the negative consequences of drug use in our society, to reduce the number of people dying and overdosing and getting involved in accidents, the number of people getting Hep C and HIV, and the number of people going to jail, but reduce the negative consequences of drugs, whether they are legal, illegal, or something in between. But then there is a second consequence, second thing that we need to pursue, and that is to reduce as much as possible the negative consequences of our drug control policies, of our policies of punitive prohibition in this country. That is the second objective. And when we ask the question, to what degree is legalization or decriminalization part of the answer? To what degree do we need to retain elements of prohibition? And is that part of the answer? It comes out of that analysis. How do we reach the best medium of reducing the negative consequences of drugs and the negative consequences of our current prohibitionist policies? That's what drives it. Now you have to go back and say, well, wait a second, how did we land up here in the first place? How did we land up with this system where these drugs, alcohol, cigarettes, the caffeinated, tobacco, that they're okay, they're legal, they're health problems, we know they're deadly, what have you. We know most people can use them without becoming, addicted, or at least with alcohol, not so much with cigarettes. But we're going to treat that as a public health issue. We're going to punish you only if you get behind the wheel of a car when you're under the influence. We're going to punish you only if you light up a cigarette in this crowded room right now. We're only going to punish you when you cause those harms to other people. Whereas these other drugs over here, marijuana, cocaine, heroin, ecstasy, MDMA, 2CB, mushrooms, methamphetamine, you name it, it's all illegal. It doesn't make any difference. You don't have to get behind the wheel of a car. You have merely to possess that thing and use it once in the privacy of your own home, and you will be treated under the American criminal law the same as a drunk driver. In fact, in many states, you will be punished far more severely for the possession of that simple marijuana joint than you will be for drunk driving. That does not seem to me as an ethical or moral law. That seems to me a fundamental flaw with prohibition. And then you ask the questions, if what we know about all these drugs is that they vary in their relative dangers. We know that some drugs can be far more dangerous. We also know that they vary in their dangers depending upon who's using them and in what context. We know that they vary depending upon their potency. That the cocaine that is being consumed in Bolivia and Peru and the coca leaf and coca teas and coca tonics, where they're effectively taking multiple lines into their body each day with no discernible health consequences, is essentially the same drug as the cocaine that people are snorting or injecting or smoking. We know that the alcohol that is used with such devastating consequences on Native American reservations is the same drug that is used in relatively benign ways in Southern Europe, where people drink and eat vino. Same drug. So why criminalization intensively on some of these and not on others? We know historically that much of that has to do not with the relative risks or dangers of the drugs, but with who uses those drugs, who is perceived as using those drugs. You know, when in the mid-1870s and 1880s, there were millions of Americans using opiate medications, primarily middle-aged white women, off in the South. They didn't have Motrin. They didn't have good sanitation. Those opiates helped stop you up and deal with diarrhea. You know, they didn't have all sorts of things. And it was a cure-all. All around the world it was a cure-all. How many people were promoting prohibition and criminalization when the principal users of opiate substances were middle-aged white women? It wasn't a popular cause. But when the use shifted towards a group of Chinese minorities coming to this country working 80, 90 hours a week and then going back home and smoking that opium pipe, the same way they had in the old country and the same way other white Americans would have that drink, that's when you got the first criminalizations. The first anti-opium criminal laws were in Nevada and right here in San Francisco and California in the 1870s directed at the Chinese minorities. The first anti-cocaine laws in the South in the beginning of the 20th century directed at black men, at Negroes, they were afraid they would forget their proper place by taking this white powder up their nose and rebel. And in every case, of course, what would they do to the vulnerable white women who could be seduced and addicted, or to the vulnerable white children? The first anti-marijuana laws in the teens and the 20s directed at Mexicans and Mexican Americans coming up, taking good jobs from good white people, going back home and smoking a little reefer, kicking back. But that funny-smelling weed, what might they do to our women and our children? And when we didn't like what they were doing in other worlds, maybe we could target them on this. You know, quite frankly, even with respect to alcohol prohibition, to some extent was a part of an ethnic, not quite racial conflict between the white Americans and the not-so-white Americans, between the white Americans who came in the 18th and early 19th century, and then between the less white Americans coming from Southern Europe and from Eastern Europe in the late 19th and early 20th century, crowding the cities, scaring the good white people, and of course bringing their traditions of beer and vino and Schlivowitz. Look at how and what is criminalized, and it has to do with who the users are. Look at the cocaine and crack thing today. Imagine if crack cocaine had become the drug that was most popular among the white middle and upper middle class. And if the powder cocaine had become the drug that was most popular among the poor underclasses. We would know, right? First of all, the nature of what we think about crack and the way we imagine crack would look quite different. Yes, it's not so good to smoke that stuff up. You smoke that stuff in that way, but who would use it would fundamentally affect that. Is it conceivable that Congress would have passed a law saying that 5 grams of crack cocaine would give you the same penalty as 500 grams of crack cocaine? No. Is it conceivable that we could have incarcerated 2.2 million people, 500,000 people directly on drug charges if most of those people were white? No. Impossible. The decriminalization will be much further along than in fact it is the case. So when I'm asked the question, where are you really on the legalization issue? I know the following things. I don't know. First, I don't have Milton Friedman's libertarian confidence that the answer is a free-for-all, totally legalized drugs with some regulation of protecting the kids. I'm not comfortable going there. I'm not certain in arguing against it, but I'm not comfortable going there. But when we're talking about my body, when you're talking about your body, I believe in a fundamental principle. I believe in the principle of our own sovereignty over our own minds and bodies. I believe in that principle. I believe that nobody, but nobody, deserves to be punished solely for what they put in their body, absent harm to others. And the consequence of that means that I believe that what I put in this body and what I possess for my own use must be and should be legal. Secondly, when it comes to marijuana and it comes to cannabis, I only got one argument against legalizing cannabis, and that's that I don't like the idea of the alcohol companies, the cigarette companies, and the pharmaceutical companies running it. But apart from that, with almost 800,000 people arrested last year for marijuana, over 700,000 simply for possession, without costing us billions of dollars a year, with people having their lives destroyed and wrecked, I would say the risks of moving the direction of cannabis legalization, whether it's going where the Dutch are or whether it's going further, are well worth it in this current context. And finally, I think we need to move in the direction of rolling back the criminal justice system as far as we possibly can. How far that is, I don't know, but as far as we possibly can in dealing with drugs, drug users, and drug addicts.
Time. Thank you. Dr. Wilson will have his opening negative statement.
Thank you very much. Judging from the enthusiastic response that Ethan's remarks gathered, I've already lost the debate, even though I have not yet uttered a single word. But I hope I can inject into your enthusiasm and your sentiments and your desire to be free of these problems some cautionary remarks that may make you wonder a bit about the consequences of making fundamental changes. I listened carefully to Ethan's remarks, hoping to figure out what he was in favor of, but I did not learn that. He would like to roll back the criminal justice system. He would like to make sure that nobody goes to prison for ingesting some substance. But what policy is this? Is he wants to legalize some drugs, all drugs, some drugs part of the time, some drugs for some people? It's not clear. Ethan brought great passion and great commitment, and his career has exemplified that passion and commitment to the topic before us. But he did not tell us what he plans to do. He criticized the war on drugs. Let me begin by saying that I don't think this country has a war on drugs. We have a war on the supply of drugs, and it has created immense problems, not only in this country, but abroad, among friendly regimes in Mexico, Colombia, Peru, Bolivia, and the like, because we have insisted that they stop supplying a demand which we have refused to control. As long as there is a demand for drugs, there will be a supply for drugs. So one of the issues, therefore, is if you're worried about drugs, you have to worry about the demand for drugs. When Ethan was talking, he said that we need to learn how to live with drugs. But he didn't tell us how we need to learn to live with drugs. He said we must reduce the negative consequences of drugs, but he never told us what those negative consequences might be. He criticized the huge disparity, which I have also criticized, between the penalties for powdered cocaine and crack cocaine, but he didn't tell you that it was Charles Rangel and the Congressional Black Caucus that cast the decisive votes in favor of that, after the administration had urged that the policy be moderated. So this makes somewhat more complicated the issue of whether it's white Americans trying to penalize blacks or black Americans trying to restrain the behavior of people that they judge, rightly or wrongly, to be threats to their community. I think when you consider drug policy, you have to understand that there are both utilitarian and moral arguments that lie at the root of the matter. And these utilitarian and moral arguments are important, and they're difficult, and they're not easily answered. The key question, if I can assume that Ethan is in favor of legalizing to some as yet unspecified degree access to drugs, is whether society will be better off. Clearly, we'll be better off in some ways. The violence that is now associated with drug dealing will be replaced by contracts. And people will not be shot, they will be sued. And that represents an enormous gain for society. But the crime and disorder committed by people who are on drugs will not go down. It will go up. It depends, of course, on what the legalization regime or the avoiding negative consequences regime might entail. If it means that penalties decline or that access to drugs is in some degree legalized, that the price of drugs will fall dramatically, the quality of drugs will improve. Under Milton Friedman's regime, they would be presumably reviewed by the Food and Drug Administration to make sure that no one would get ill, and they would be sold at Walgreens and CVS. This is not the view of Ethan, but it is the principle against which one has to contrast the present policy with the future policy. If the price falls, if you can purchase drugs to some degree safely, if you can ingest drugs that are, you know in advance, not harmful, then the number of people ingesting these drugs will go up. How far will they go up? No one knows, because no country anywhere in the world has ever legalized heroin, cocaine, or methamphetamine. And because that's not been legalized anywhere, we don't know for certain what the consequences would be if we relaxed the penalties in this country about them. But let's speculate. If the price would fall, as is generally estimated, by 95%, offset by whatever taxes the government should impose on them, and if the purity was improved, and if drug sales fell more under contract law than under street gang violence law, then the number of people enjoying these drugs would go up. Go up by how many? We don't know. Let's assume that there are roughly 2 million regular cocaine users in the country. It's not unimaginable that this number would increase by a factor of 4 or 5 or 6. We can't be confident of it, but we know that a certain substantial fraction of that increased number would find that they were no longer able to be part of a family, to pursue their education, to get and hold a job. They would be reduced to the lives of the people I have watched in the Skid Row areas of Los Angeles, hopeless victims of drug abuse who live on the streets because they cannot live anywhere else. Now, there are two strategies for dealing with this state of affairs. One strategy is for the government to pay welfare payments to people who are drug dependent. I find it difficult that Congress, no matter which party is in control of it, will vote for welfare for drug dependents. The other alternative is crime. I fear that crime would be the preferred alternative, and that instead of having 1 or 2 million crack cocaine addicts on the streets of our cities, we might have 8 or 10 million, because crack is an enormously addictive substance. And people who ingest it regularly discover that they have made themselves, in a certain fraction of cases, not all, the slaves of this substance, in a way that some people who ingest alcohol have made themselves the slaves of these substances. Alcohol is powerfully addictive for some people. Cocaine is powerfully addictive for some people. We have learned more or less to live with alcohol. The question really before us is, do we want to increase easily the supply of addictive substances in our society to see how many more souls we can destroy, how many more characters we can corrupt, how many more people we can exile to the Skid Rows of Los Angeles and San Francisco and Seattle and other cities? To deal with this, we really have to think about the moral issues involved here. Now, there are essentially two leading spokesmen for the moral issues. One was John Stuart Mill, who in his famous essay on liberty said that the government should not control the behavior of other people unless that behavior affected materially the direct and palpable interests of others. If a man wishes to become drunk, he was entitled to become drunk so long as he did not harm someone else. The other view is the view of Aristotle, who said that the primary function of government is to shape and enhance human character. And much of Western civilization has been a struggle between finding a solution between the contrary views of Mill and Aristotle. And we struggle continuously with no satisfactory view in sight. The moral question is not easily settled because a strict libertarian view is impossible to defend. In a strictly libertarian view, that is to say, the view that the government must not interfere with human life except to protect people from direct and material harm visited upon them by others, we would have no law against incest, no law that requires you to wear clothing in public, no ban on polygamy, no ban on public and obscene displays. On the other hand, how far do we want those bans to extend? Do we want those bans to extend as far as Aristotle and the classics of ancient Greece once argued? Most Americans would say no. We want something in between. But where? The emancipation of mankind, which began in the West in the 18th century and has extended now throughout the world, liberating people from ancient tyrannies and outmoded slogans and the vices of oppressive dictators, has given rise to enormous gains and enormous costs. Milton Friedman once said there's no such thing as a free lunch. I would add there's no such thing as a free culture. Because the emancipation of human freedom leads people to do wonderful things, remarkable things, and also horrible and intolerable things. We are now engaged in a mighty struggle with radical branches of Islam to find out whether the West, with its commitment to enlightenment and emancipation, will survive, or whether the radical Muslim view that there should be a Sharia law for all of us will prevail. Where do we draw the line? It's not entirely clear. Medical marijuana has come to California. Another vote for Ethan. The laws that depenalize the private possession of marijuana are now in effect in 10 to 12 states. And it's not obvious that these laws have produced any direct material harm. So how far do we wish to extend this? This requires a careful analysis of the nature of these drugs. Marijuana has some harmful effects. It also has some desirable medical effects. Crack cocaine has no desirable medical effects and has almost entirely harmful effects. Methamphetamine has no desirable effects and almost entirely harmful effects. Heroin has some beneficial effects. It makes you sleepy. And for people who need to go to sleep, I suppose heroin is a useful substitute for Ambien. But it has disastrous effects on the capability of people to function. In order to think about this, we have to have a policy suggested by Ethan and others who share his view about what concrete changes we should make. And we have to debate those policies specifically. We cannot rest upon the notion that we must, quote, avoid the negative consequences of our present actions, or that we must, quote, learn how to live with drugs, unquote. Those are slogans. Those are not policies. Those are phrases. Those are not arguments. I was raised, alas, in a tradition of studying public policy in which you learned that the devil is in the details. To think through these issues, you have to have a policy that you can discuss. I dislike many aspects of America's drug policies. I dislike its emphasis on trying to control supply, or leaving demand essentially unregulated. I think that that is a grievous mistake. The one part of our culture that has addressed the demand problem is the United States military, which has essentially eliminated most oppressive forms of drug use. Of course, the military has certain advantages. It has controls over its members that are absent, happily, for most of civilian society. But there are other ways you can reduce demand. Over 50% of the people arrested in any given city at any given time were on drugs at the time they were arrested. And since our ability to detect drug use only goes back about 72 hours, we have to assume that in all likelihood they were actively involved in drugs for a much longer period of time, but were unable to measure it. Most of these people are put on probation rather than sentenced, and those who are sentenced are usually released on parole. What do we do with probationers and parolees who have a significant drug habit? The answer is next to nothing. And yet, without insulting the desirable liberties of free people, we have the right to control the behavior of probationers and parolees in our society. We can make them take frequent drug tests. They have, in effect, waived their Fourth Amendment entitlement to be free of unreasonable searches and seizures. If you're on probation or parole, you are subject to unreasonable searches and seizures if the government thinks they are wise. There are many people who seek public benefits, who wish access to housing or welfare payments or the like, who can be asked to show that they're reasonably free of drugs as a condition of receiving those benefits. Now, I'm not sure whether any or all of these policies would make sense, but those are policies whereby we might try to embrace the problem of attacking the demand for drugs. And without attacking for the demand for drugs, our supply-oriented strategy in this country is of no value. Therefore, let me urge Ethan, in the minutes that remain to us, that he suggests some concrete steps that he would like us to take, and let me see if I can manage to agree with him on some of these matters or disagree with him. Thank you very much.
Mr. Nadelmann, 5 minutes.
You know, I basically agree with Jim on one key point he made, which is that we're basically talking here about arguments that are either utilitarian or moral. And it's in looking at both of those types of arguments that we will come up with the best policy. Now, the utilitarian argument, when we look at the relative costs and benefits of different types of drug policies, is a pivotal part of what we're talking about. It's why so many people, so many conservative economists coming from the law and economics background, not just Milton Friedman, but many others, are in agreement, more or less, with the views that I've laid out here. It also means comparing what we can truly compare. The way most of the critique on legalization per se persists is by painting some abstract here, where it is truly impossible to know what the consequences would be of taking that leap, and at the same time acknowledging that that leap to legalization is a leap that is impossible to imagine in America or in almost any country. There is no 18th Amendment of drug prohibition to be repealed as the 21st Amendment repealed the 18th. There is no Berlin Wall of drug prohibition to come crumbling down. It will inevitably be an evolutionary process. You know, what I would like to challenge Jim on is he says, here's the problems with legalization, and in practice, but in practice, we live today with the problems of prohibition. We live today with the problems of prohibition in the hands of politicians, and we live with those consequences. In 1980, we had 50,000 people behind bars in America on a drug charge. Today, it's almost 500,000 people behind bars tonight for violating a drug law. We lock up more people in America for violating a drug law than all of Western Europe locks up for everything, and they have 100 million more people than we do. Our overall prison population, prison and jail, has gone from 500,000 in 1980 to 2.25 million today. When America has 5% of the world's population, we have 25% of the world's prison population. 5% of the world's population, 25% of the world's prison population. We rank first in the world in the per capita incarceration of our fellow citizens. The Russians keep huffing and puffing, trying to keep up. They can't do it. We are number one. And what's driving that more than anything is the war on drugs. 500,000 people behind bars tonight. Another 100, 150, 200,000 people we don't know for sure who are there because they handed in a dirty urine because of the drug test that Jim recommends, oftentimes with no other offense, but are then reincarcerated. And then look at the people who are in situations of prostituting or stealing in order to support their habits. Right? Also a consequence of prohibition. And then, of course, the violent criminals who are fighting it out over corners and drug dealing, who must be punished because they are committing acts of violence, but who are oftentimes a creation, just as Al Capone was a creation of drug prohibition. Jim says, we don't have a war on drugs, we have a war on supply. I don't think so. I think we have a war on human beings. That's what it's about. We have millions of Americans today living with a felony conviction for a drug law violation. We have millions of Americans, the only criminal violation involves drugs and nothing else. We have 1.5 million people today who cannot vote because they once violated a drug law and are deprived of the right to vote. We have people being deprived of access to student scholarships and benefits and housing and what have you, and being discriminated against in the way no other criminal violators are because of this drug prohibition. I would ask Jim if he would repeal all of those sanctions there. I would ask him, where is he on the issue of needle exchange, where every society, advanced society, is doing that to reduce the spread of AIDS, but where I think Jim's voice has been silent. I would ask him what he would do about the outbreak of overdose fatalities when people are trying to look at other interventions to reduce this based upon treating drug use primarily as a health issue rather than a criminal issue. Jim says, attack the demand. I think that's the wrong way to go about it. The demand for psychoactive drugs has always been and will always be, and we need to learn to manage this. We live in a society with television ads advertising everything, asking you, do you feel sad? Do you feel worried? Do you feel agitated? Do you feel anything at all? Because we have a drug for you. In this world, the number of drugs that are illegal are only a small part of all the psychoactive drugs out there. Our challenge truly is to learn how to live with that in ways that minimize the role of coercion, minimize the role of the criminal justice system, and elevate respect for freedom, compassion, health, and human rights. Thank you.
Dr. Wilson, 5 minutes.
I'm still waiting for Ethan to make a single concrete suggestion. More slogans, more phrases, more glowing arguments, no concrete suggestions. He points out the prison population in the United States is one of the highest in the world, and it is. He also says that that prison population is largely based, or disproportionately based, on locking up people because they have privately possessed or ingested an addictive substance. We don't know that. We know what people were sent to prison for as the result of a plea bargain. We don't know from these statistics what behavior they engaged in at the time they were caught. Many, I believe, having studied prisons off and on during my life, were engaged in robberies and burglaries and assaults, but pled down to drug possession as a way of avoiding a more serious penalty, meanwhile giving up, as part of their plea bargain arrangement, the names of their competitive drug salesmen to the authorities so the authorities could arrest them. The American prison population is large, but we've purchased something by it. We have a falling crime rate, whereas Europe has a rising crime rate. Europe may imprison fewer people than America, but the prospects of having your car stolen or your home being burgled are 2 to 3 times higher in England and France and Germany than they are here. Now, if you want to say that this is all because we've been locking up people who have been smoking a reefer, then you have to produce some evidence of it. And from the statistics we have available, this evidence doesn't work, isn't available. Now, if he wishes to talk about harm reduction, that's fine. Needle exchanges for heroin users are probably a useful form of harm reduction. You provide clean needles that avoids AIDS, and so far as we know, does not increase drug use. But there is no equivalent harm reduction policy for dealing with crack cocaine or methamphetamine. You don't pass out crack pipes. You don't make cleaner methamphetamine in hopes that people will have a happier time, because people who take these drugs don't have a happy time no matter how they are consumed. And as a consequence, it seems to me, if we're going to do more than talk about phrases such as needle exchange, which is a plausibly good idea, if we're going to talk about more than medical marijuana, which I think is a plausibly good idea, if we want to deal with the reason that most people go to prison for being involved with drugs, which is to say they were dealing in large amounts, or they settled on a drug plea because they did not wish to take the more severe penalty that was associated with their actual behavior, we have to talk about what we're going to do. Ethan says he doesn't embrace Milton Friedman's thoroughgoing libertarian critique. It's understandable. I don't embrace it either. My last debate on this subject was, in fact, with Milton, and it was before an audience of economists, which meant I lost 99-1. The one vote was cast by my wife. But what short of a libertarian change will help us avoid the negative consequences? I await Ethan making a statement that is something more than a slogan.
Ethan, 5 minutes.
Jim, I think you are becoming deliberately and willfully hard of hearing. I was quite explicit about many of the harm reduction steps. I was quite explicit about removing the criminal prohibition from the personal possession of drugs for one's own use. I was quite explicit about where we should go with respect to cannabis. Maybe I say I'm not sure if it's the full legalization model or whether it's the Dutch model, but in the same way that when people talked about repealing alcohol prohibition, there was no one view. Right? People had a dozen, 100 different reasons about what was most wrong with alcohol prohibition, and 1,000 different reasons about what should come in its place. Should it be what Utah and 18 other states do with a liquor control monopoly, or should it be just sold in beer in pubs or restaurants or what have you? What should the taxation rate? I think that many of those answers can be left up to local control and local solution. But those are very precise proposals. I do think that what the Europeans, and for that matter now the Canadians, have begun to do with experimenting with heroin prescription trials. The Swiss began doing this in the early 1990s. They set up a national trial to prescribe pharmaceutical heroin to people who had been addicted to heroin for a long time, who had been to jail, who had been affected with disease, who had tried drug-free, who had tried methadone, and nothing worked. And they found, after evaluating this, that in fact they did work. It significantly reduced the use not only of illegal heroin, but of other drugs as well. It significantly reduced criminality and criminal behavior and arrest. It enabled people to help get their lives together. In fact, many of these people did not fit the caricature that Jim provides of the junkie, of the drug addict. These were people who were able to get a job and hold responsible jobs. And the cost-benefit study showed that the cost of this relatively expensive intervention was more than paid for by the reductions in health care costs and criminal justice costs. Then the Germans and the Dutch and the English and the Canadians, even the Spanish have tried the same thing. But here in America, we seem unable to talk about such a thing. Here in America, the National Institute on Drug Abuse, a highly politicized funding agency, cannot imagine having an open discussion about this or providing the funding. Here in America, we have the politicization of scientific research in the same way that you did in the old Soviet Union, where scientists become fearful of raising certain questions, applying for certain research proposals, because they may be not just turned down, but put on a list that denies them entree and access and all other things in the future. Jim, I've offered specific proposals, and I think you need to be specific, too, about what it is about drug prohibition that you like and that you care for. Because ultimately, you're also right. I think that this ultimately is a moral issue. It is a moral issue. I've set out a moral standard for me and for this organization and for many people in the drug policy reform movement, which is that people do not deserve to be punished for what they put in their body, absent harm to others. I want to know where you stand on that. Do you believe that, yes, people should be punished for what they put in their body in the absence of any harm to others? That they should be punished? That they deserve to be punished? You talk about the evolution of the Enlightenment and of civilization, mostly in a positive sense, I believe. But, you know, to some extent, what that evolution has been about is in reducing the discrimination against people for doing things and engaging in behaviors that do no harm to others, and saying we will no longer persecute Jews and Catholics and religious minorities because they practice the way they do. We will no longer persecute these people because they write what they do. We will no longer persecute those people because they believe or they practice or or because they are born of a particular race or gender or sexual preference. That is about the evolution of freedom. And I oftentimes see this war on drugs and the mentality that lies behind it, the mentality of punitive prohibition, the knee-jerk assumption that people should be deprived of their freedom or punished because of what they put in their body, as sort of the last manifestation of this repressive instinct in our societies, that last remaining desire to want to punish people for being different, for choosing to take risks that we would not take, or choosing to take risks that we hope our children would not take. Societies have always been afraid of that. We have to have a little more faith and confidence in human freedom. Thank you.
Dr. Wilson, 5 minutes.
Ethan said that he believed there should be no penalties for the private possession of drugs, no punishment for what people consume. That is essentially the Milton Friedman argument, so that he's not backed away from it. He has embraced the libertarian view. If there are no penalties for the private possession, then it would be difficult to see how we could punish private transactions. If there is no punishment for what people consume, I don't see how there can be a punishment for what people buy. Now, it's possible to imagine a world in which the sale of heroin, cocaine, and methamphetamine were legal, or it was illegal, but we wouldn't punish anybody for simply consuming it. This would be, in effect, an effort either to expand our supply-oriented strategy, get tough on the dealers and ignore the consumers, or it would be a backward way of saying that we will abandon the effort to punish the suppliers as well, which is, in short, the fundamental libertarian position. If that is Ethan's view, either that we don't punish the private purchasers and try to punish the dealers, or we admit that we can't have such a diverse policy, so we'll not punish either, it means that drug consumption in this country will increase. What do I want? I want to reduce the demand for psychoactive substances that, in my view and the view of serious scholars who have looked at it, find is deeply destructive of human character. Now, there are many ways of reducing the demand. The military tried one strategy. Our policy, insofar as it makes it difficult to buy these drugs, is another policy. All of that goes away if what he talks about is avoiding punishing people for their private consumption. It means, for example, that our treatment programs, in a sense, evaporate. Our treatment programs, whatever they're called, and there are many different treatment programs, most of which have some substantial value, work only when the person subject to them is constrained. Constrained in one of two ways. Constrained either by a life that has gone to hell, and they know it's gone to hell, and they're old enough to realize that unless they stick with the treatment program, they will lose everything, including their life, or they're compelled to be in the treatment program. This effort at constraint, and in the extreme case at compulsion, is what makes treatment programs work. Treatment for persons who privately possess drugs and privately consume drugs, should they consume them at a level that creates a problem for them, and of course consumption does not create a problem for all people, means simply having a place to crash and cool out for 72 hours before you can get back on your feet. The treatment programs for drug abuse evaporate under a rule that says there are no penalties for the private possession of the drug. Now, I don't think people who privately possess drugs should be sent to prison. I'm embarrassed, scandalized by the fact that 20 years ago, 8% of our state prison population consisted of people who claimed that they were drug offenders, and now it's 30 to 35% of our state prison population is composed of people who claim they were drug offenders. Now, partitioning this out is difficult because you don't know whether what they claim is in fact what they did, because there are ambiguities in the criminal justice system that means that these claims have to be looked at somewhat suspiciously. I would much prefer that penalties for the private use be much shorter, much quicker, administratively imposed, and involve, at a maximum, a weekend in jail, a week in jail, simply in order to provide an incentive for people who are using drugs beyond the ability of their bodies to sustain its use, to provide them with incentive that treatment is a feasible option, and that there are benefits to having a treatment that are foregone if we do not have those constraints. If we don't have those constraints, it seems to me, then I think his policy, Ethan's policy, of avoiding punishing people for anything they consume means the end of our effort to reduce the impact of psychoactive drugs, and the end of most treatment programs.
We have reached a point in our debate in which the debaters have a chance to ask each other a direct question. And Ethan will go first, and then Dr. Wilson will have a chance to answer about 5 minutes.
Okay, thank you. I mean, very quickly, and Jim, it would involve two proposals that I put out here, and then a third, which is the issue you just raised. The first is, would you say that this country should surely proceed with heroin prescription trials as other countries have? Not the sorts that the Brits did years ago with letting people take stuff home, but just allowing that. Secondly, I've made the argument for legalizing cannabis, essentially, or moving very close in that direction, given the incredible negative consequences of the current policy. Would you support that, or if not, why not, or how far would you go? And lastly, and this goes directly to the point you were making, which is a more finer point distinction, when it comes to people who have been arrested for drug possession, nothing more, who are then put on a diversion program and who are being urine tested, and that person is holding a job, caring for their family, but nonetheless, they consistently and persistently keep testing positive for drugs in the absence of any evident harm, but an abundant evidence that they are contributing to society in positive ways. What would you do? Would you still take away their freedom?
5 minutes, Dr. Wilson.
Would I allow the private possession of marijuana for medical uses? Yes. Would I do it the way we do it in California? No. And the difference between that is simply that in California, you need only a doctor's recommendation. You do not need a prescription. And since the drug apparently has some direct medical benefits, it seems to me that its use and its administration should fall entirely under the management of physicians who are aware of its value and are prepared to use it in a controlled environment. This is a different world than the hundreds of head shops that have opened all over California, where the, quote, doctor's recommendation, unquote, is nothing more often than an oral statement. Would I allow heroin prescription trials? No. Why would I not allow heroin prescription trials? Because I don't see how you can avoid the bad experience that England had. That is to say, you prescribe heroin, they take the heroin that was prescribed, they divide the dose in half, they sell half on the streets in order to encourage a black market, and then they take the other half for themselves. And when they go in to ask the doctor for a prescription, they always say they want an even bigger prescription than the doctor thinks is necessary. And so they continue to split and sell and create a problem. If you want a heroin prescription trial that it takes place entirely in a hospital, in a clinic setting where none of this can occur, and the heroin is administered by a registered nurse, and you're not allowed to take any at home, I have one confident prediction: no one will show up. Heroin use is not something you do in a clinical setting. There was a third question, Ethan, and I've forgotten what it was. I was taking notes when you were talking, and I forgot the problem. But on these two issues, heroin prescription trials, no. Legalizing marijuana for medical use, yes.
Dr. Wilson, your chance.
I didn't know I had a chance. I was going to have to ask a question before I even unsuccessfully answered the questions Ethan asked me. But let me formulate the question this way. Ethan, if you were confident from your own analysis or the experience of other places that legalizing the private possession of drugs would increase the number of people using these dangerous drugs by a factor of 4 or 5, would you still be in favor of it?
Okay. Yeah. Okay, Jim. I have to say, Jim, going back, I give you about a C- on your answers to my two questions. You talked about medical marijuana and talked about the joke of the doctor's recommendation. That's the process that's used only because federal law is not grounded in science and makes it impossible for doctors to make its own recommendation on a prescription form. Beyond that, the open-ended nature of what's happening in California has more to do with the law itself that was drafted by local activists and allows the recommendation for any medical condition. In the other dozen states where it's a more restricted set of medical circumstances that you can have it recommended for, there is no such problem. Similarly, with respect to what you said about heroin maintenance, you're flat out incorrect. In Switzerland, in these other places where, in point of fact, they are given the drugs by a registered nurse in a clinic, and they do go. Sorry. It is a legitimate scientific study. The third question was really what would you do about the person on parole or probation who is not engaged in any harm to others and is in fact engaged in legal, law-abiding activity, responsible, but keeps handing in dirty urines. With respect to your question, if in fact drug use, you said of these dangerous drugs would increase, I believe, although I'm not advocating here for the full legalization, and I think you're wrong to say that my right of possession, my very strong civil libertarian impulse, comes down to the same thing as Milton Friedman's very strong market libertarian impulse. I think those things are not, they overlap a bit, but they are not fundamentally the same thing. I believe that if we moved in the direction of fuller decriminalization, even legalization, you would see a wider variety of drugs used by more different sorts of people with significantly fewer negative consequences. What most people want are drugs that work for them. Most people don't want the things that are going to destroy them within 6 months or a year or whatever it might be. Most people, given a choice, lean towards the safer over the more dangerous. What we see is that the vast majority of people in this society and most other societies don't incline and are not inclined to do things like smoking methamphetamine or crack cocaine. Most people aren't interested in going there. I think the challenge truly is about the domestication of drugs in our society. When Lou Dobbs on CNN recently was saying that America uses, what did he say, 25, 50% of all the drugs in America, that was ludicrous. The countries of Pakistan and Iran have higher heroin addiction rates than we do. Brazil has a cocaine use problem. We may be first when it comes to Ritalin. But that says something. I think whether we like it or not, we're evolving into society where many, many people are going to be using many, many different types of psychoactive drugs. And that what we need to do is not to make believe it's not happening, not to put all the power in the hands of pharmaceutical companies or perhaps doctors who are prescribing and know what they know based upon the golf trips they got from the pharmaceutical companies. I think what we need to move in the direction of is empowering the consumer. That means more and accurate information. That means using the website. That means, yes, civil liability is better than prison and criminal sanctions. But I think that we are a drug-using society and a drug-using world. I think the amounts of drugs that are being used are going up, and that all of these drugs, from marijuana to the new pharmaceutical psychoactives, are potentially dangerous and potentially helpful, or actually helpful for so many people. We need to acknowledge that drug use may go up. Whether we call it dangerous drug use or not may have less to do with the drug itself than with the context and the situation in which they are being used. And at that point, we seek to reduce the negative consequences, not through criminalization, which exacerbates them, but through proper education and proper regulation.
Thank you. We've now reached the point of the debate in which we'll have closing statements. I would ask those who wish to ask questions to begin thinking about them, and at the end of the second closing statement, start lining up at the microphone here on the left. Dr. Wilson will deliver the first closing statement. 5 minutes.
The issue between Ethan and myself is, I think, simply stated. His argument is that conferring on people consumer sovereignty, letting them decide what they want to put in their mouth or inject in their arm, is a desirable strategy. But somehow this differs from the libertarian view that all drugs should be legalized. I don't think it does. I don't think it differs the slightest. If we wish to allow people to consume the drug, if we encourage the consumption by removing penalties for it, then it seems to me we cannot sustain an active campaign to reduce the supply of these drugs. Most people, he said, want safety, and therefore consumer sovereignty can be trusted. That's not true, and it's not true for 2 reasons. The first is biological. We now know, something we didn't know 20 years ago, that people differ in their biological susceptibility to drug use. There are people who have used cocaine and heroin and marijuana and have gotten nothing out of it. There are people who use it and can use it only on weekends at parties. And there are other people who, once they use it, become committed to the drug. And the difference is not to be found primarily in their social experiences. It is to be found in their biology. And the question is, how much of this biology do we wish to trust by making the private possession of these drugs harmless? And not only harmless, but in the long run safe, because with the legalization that I'm sure would follow of the drug trafficking business, the safety issue would be taken care of. The other factor is that addictive processes work in a way that suspends human judgment. Now again, there are people who can use dangerous drugs and not be harmed by them, in fact not even be interested in them, who can use them safely at parties and on weekends. But there are other people for whom the addictive process is a growing commitment to the drug to the exclusion of all other things. Now, there have been experiments with animals, no experiments with humans, but experiments with animals that suggest that many animals will starve to death if that is the only alternative to consuming continuing supplies of drugs. It's been tried on rats, it's been tried on primates. It seems to be the case. What would happen if it's tried on people? Again, I'm driven by my experiences on Skid Row in Los Angeles. You walk among these streets and you see these absolutely destroyed human beings. And what were they destroyed by? Well, a lot of things usually, not simple, one thing, but in most cases they were destroyed by drugs. They simply cannot function any longer as an effective member of society. How large do we want this group to be? Do we want it to be much larger than Skid Row in Los Angeles? I hope not. Can we manage to keep that group smaller without sending people off to long prison terms? I think the answer is yes. We can recruit them into homes for the homeless. We can insist that a condition of being in these homes is to remain drug-free. We can enforce this by drug tests. The penalty for failing the drug tests is to lose the home, but not necessarily to lose, to have access to prison. There are many ways to prevent this. Focusing on the demand for drugs, it seems to me, is crucial. Not for everybody, not for all of those people who raised their hands in this room earlier indicating that they'd tried various drugs. If you tried various drugs and were addicted, you wouldn't be here tonight. You would be doing something else, something probably much less pleasant, if you can regard this debate as pleasant. Of course that's true. But for many people, it seems to me, it is not true. That this addictive process means you forego the capacity to understand the likely consequences of your own actions. You become literally a prisoner. And we have to try to sketch out a policy that will try, in my view, to prevent this population from growing inordinately in size.
Mr. Nadelmann, 5 minutes.
Okay, I want to thank Jim Wilson for engaging in this debate. I have enjoyed it thoroughly. I hope you have as well. Jim, about those animals, there are other studies that show when you give drugs or make drugs available to animals, not in cages but in the wild, the studies of Bruce Alexander in Canada and other people, they in fact don't necessarily exhibit the types of addictive characteristics that you described. I do agree with you. Consumer sovereignty cannot be trusted. We can't trust everybody. We can't trust everybody to know what's good for them. We know that some people will use drugs stupidly and will become addicted and will lose some element of self-control. The problem is it's all relative. Because what I trust even less than consumer sovereignty is the sovereignty of the state. The sovereignty of the state in the hands of the politicians who run it, driven by vested interests and by law enforcement. The hands of the state and the sovereignty of the state over human beings to tell them what is good and what must be good for them. To transform into law its own prejudices based upon its own ignorances. You talk about the legal and the illegal as two separate worlds, and yet now we see that, in fact, according to the National Institute on Drug Abuse and other surveys, more and more of the substance abuse in America has to do with the quote-unquote prescription drugs, with the OxyContins and oxycodones and the stimulant drugs and what kids are doing with Ritalin and adults are doing with this's and that's. And I don't know if we have Viagra abuse yet, but surely it will be around soon. In fact, we do, I heard. We do. It's not so simple. It's not so simple. Something like 100,000 people die each year because of the misprescription of drugs by physicians. Putting our hands in their trust and their confidence has been a deadly mistake for large numbers of Americans. So yes, consumer sovereignty is shaky. It is weak. It is vulnerable. We are all vulnerable. But perhaps the fundamental divide in our positions has to do with how we view human nature and how strongly we elevate the values of freedom and compassion relative to others. I believe, based upon not just my own gut feelings, but my reading of history, my reading of this society, that the numbers of people who are truly vulnerable to become seriously drug addicted in the way of the crack addicts that you see in the ghettos of Los Angeles is not that great. So many people who are seriously addicted are addicted not to one drug but to multiple drugs. And so many people who can handle one drug can handle many others as well. And so many people who get into trouble with some drugs are able to get out of drugs without being coerced by the state. Without being coerced by the state. I think your view of human nature is overly pessimistic. And ultimately, it will not help us in the world that we are evolving and emerging into. And finally, when I think about the core values that should gird our drug policy, it boils down to me to three things: freedom, compassion, and responsibility. Freedom, the freedom not to be punished for what I put in my body absent harm to others. That fundamental human right, that fundamental human freedom over my consciousness, my mental, my physical being. That's first. And if that means we take certain risks in respect of that freedom, then so be it. Secondly, compassion. Because when people do stumble, when people do have a hard time, they need a helping hand. And they need it not just once, but twice, but thrice, and more. When people get caught up in drugs, they need that help. And not just the coercion of the court with a drug test, which works for some people but backfires for so many others. What they need is the compassion of the harm reduction approach, of meeting people where they are at, of acknowledging that people may have to reduce their drug use bit by bit, that they may be getting their life together here while they handle this piece of it. Compassion and the treatment of drug addictions with fundamental respect for that human being. And finally, responsibility. Because I don't believe that drug addiction can be an excuse. I think people must be held responsible for their actions. I don't ultimately care whether or not the people who broke in my car was under the influence of drugs or not. That person must be held responsible. A judge may make a policy choice to offer that person treatment if that's what's better than prison, but they must be held responsible. So ultimately, freedom, compassion, responsibility, I think that's the way we build a sensible drug policy for the future. Thank you very much.
As people are lining up at the microphone, I just want to thank both of our debaters for a very spirited and civil debate. I hope that you will also recognize the uniqueness of this program and that you will tell to friends and family and encourage them to look at the debates online. Okay, we'll take our first question. Please, everyone in the audience, please.
You based your argument on two suppositions. One that is with when we have legalization, that the purity of drugs will go up. But actually, we know that prohibition causes the quality of drugs to go up. People were using coca before there was prohibition. Now they're using cocaine. They were using opium before prohibition. Now they're using opium. So that's your first supposition that was wrong. Then you had a supposition about price. You said that if these drugs become legal, that the price will go down by a factor of 10. And we have some substances that were illegal that have become legal.
Sir, just your question, please.
I'll continue for a moment. Thank you. So, and that substance was alcohol. And we know that when Prohibition ended, alcohol went down by half in price. And you know that when we had Prohibition, people went from beer to whiskey, and then it took 50 years for the percentage of whiskey to beer to go back to what it was before Prohibition.
Sir,
and you have a third problem, and that is...
Sir, do you have a question?
Thank you very much.
Please, sir, if you don't ask a question, we're going to have to cut you
Okay,
off.
this is the last one. The third thing is...
Sir, do you have a question?
Yes.
If you do not have a question, please...
I want to know how you say that with civil regulation, rather than criminal regulation, we would have a higher drug rate. Because the one time that we've tried civil regulation with tobacco, you remember, when 20 years ago we had 50% addiction rate, and now we have a 25% addiction rate?
Sure.
And that's
we
civil
understand
regulation.
the nature of your question.
So basically, your arguments are all false.
We understand the nature of your question, sir. Folks, look, I want as many people to be able to ask questions as possible, and we cannot have this. Ask a direct question, and then we can get through as many of them as we can.
I actually have a question.
Who's it directed to,
thank
sir?
both of the debaters for their erudite comments. I've learned a lot tonight. My name is Dan Cicceroni. I'm a professor and physician at UCSF. I thought the debate was a little bit data light. Okay, there is data on the natural history of drug pricing and drug purity. Okay, so for example, I got a Freedom of Information Act request to the DEA, and it can tell you that over the past 15 years, heroin purity has gone up by a factor of 2 to 3, and heroin pricing has gone down to about 80% of where it started. So my question is, for Dr. Wilson, what does this say for our war on drug supply? And for Dr. Nadelmann, during this period of time, heroin overdose has increased. So what does this say for the consequences of increased heroin supply?
Thank you very much.
Your data are quite correct. Quality of heroin has gone up. The price has gone down, which suggests to me that our supply-only strategy has failed. And the fact that heroin overdoses have gone up does not surprise me. But your facts are quite accurate.
With respect to the issue of overdose, it's very hard to say whether or not that's a function of the increasing purity and decreasing price, because I don't think we've seen a dramatic increase in the number of heroin users that's similar to the number of heroin overdose fatalities. It could have to do with an aging of the population, and that as the heroin using population has gotten older, they're more susceptible, more vulnerable to overdose. Most overdoses happen among people in the late 30s, 40s, or 50s, not among younger people. So that's one possibility. It also could say that this has happened in a context where we have not had nationwide harm reduction programs that can help avoid and reduce the likelihood. We now have Narcan, naloxone, to try to, that's a drug, if any of you saw Pulp Fiction, where she takes the heroin instead of the cocaine, and then John Travolta jabs the needle in there. That was an overly dramatic version of Narcan, an antidote. If that were massively available, that might make a huge difference. Unfortunately, the Drug Czar's office has not yet gotten behind that.
Thank you. Sir.
Good debate, by the way. Thanks. This question is for Dr. Nadelmann. You mentioned quickly the increase of the prison population due to drug-related charges in the United States. For example, the fact that we have the highest rate of incarcerated individuals per capita in the U.S. Do you think the hesitation of the legalization of drugs, most notably marijuana, is in part due to the increasing corporational power of privately owned prisons, the juvenile facilities, since they have been on the rise sharply since the 1980s in California? There's been a large increase in privately owned prisons and juvenile facilities. And the numbers you gave, 500,000 individuals tonight, will be sitting in prison due to drug-related charges. It seems to me that there is an imminent pressure. That is, do you think the privatization and capitalizing of human incarceration is preventing or putting pressure on the legalization of drugs?
Great, thank you.
I think that's a minor factor. I think the growing power of the private prison builders, corporations, especially in the South of the United States and elsewhere, and they obviously have a financial interest in building more prisons. And so they have been a force for opposing some reforms. I don't think it's been focused on marijuana. The prison guards unions have been even more of a problem, especially here in California and some other states, although there are recent indications that the current California prison guards union is beginning to change their position in regards to the incarceration of drug offenders. And the current overcrowding crisis, their interests have shifted a bit. I think it has a lot more to do with other factors. When you said private forces, I would point to some extent to the Partnership for a Drug-Free America, heavily funded by pharmaceutical companies, which have a strong interest in distinguishing between their drugs and the other drugs. I would also point to people's basic fear of change. Even, that we haven't, unlike alcohol prohibition where people can remember when it was legal, that's not true with marijuana. And I think $1 billion ad campaign each year that's supposedly about protecting the kids, but that's really about reinforcing adult citizen opposition to marijuana and a change in policy is what's really driving it.
Thank you.
Sir,
hello.
Please.
This is for Mr. Wilson. I've done a lot of research into the history before drug prohibition, and none of the conditions that you mentioned as a result of legalization existed then. I've checked and I've checked and I've checked in the old newspaper archives. I went through the entire New York Times from 1910 through 1914. In that period, I did not find a single drug crime mentioned, not a robbery, burglary, mugging, anything connected with drugs. Also, I didn't find any accidental overdoses recorded in that time period. In addition, I've done research on papers going back to 1880, hundreds of thousands of them, and I don't find any accidental overdoses, and I don't find any crimes mentioned with it. What's the morality of promoting a prohibition policy that causes crime, death, and disease, where none existed before?
Thank you.
You're generally correct about the modest effects of a legalization strategy in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And that's because of who was using the drugs. Somebody earlier said, I forget who it was, I think it was Ethan, that middle-aged white ladies in the South used coca or cocaine. Quite true. Cole Porter wrote a famous song about not getting turned on by cocaine. The problem changed when the behavior of the people changed. The behavior of the people changed because drugs which had initially been used by ordinary citizens filtered down and became part of the lifestyle of the unsettled people. And this is what created a problem. Suddenly we discovered that crime rates went up as drug consumption increased. And that is in large measure what drove the federal policy toward tightening the laws about drug use. You cannot compare conditions in 1890 with conditions in 1960 because the people who using the drugs were different. Now maybe we should adopt a policy that says we don't care who uses the drug, we'll have the same policy for everyone. But that's not the way the world works. The way the world works is that we look at, see what people are doing and ask whether this creates a social problem or not. And when it does create a social problem, we try to do something about it.
I don't find any of that in the record that you say.
Next. Please.
Keep reading.
This is a question for Dr. Wilson. Why do you hate freedom, sir? Sorry, I just had to say that. Actually, my question is...
Your question, sir, please.
Yes. My brother is addicted to crack. He's been in prison 3 times. He's in prison now. How has putting him in prison helped him to get off of addiction to crack? He's had every kind of treatment they offer him in the criminal justice system.
It hasn't. Going to prison hasn't helped him get off crack.
Right. Well, don't you think maybe we should try a different system?
What is the different system?
How about not sending him to prison when he's got dirty urine?
So you would prefer he function in the community where who would take care of him?
He's a car mechanic. He takes care of himself, except when he's in prison.
No. But you think being a crack addict would not affect his ability to fix your car? It would affect my confidence in his ability to fix my car.
Next question, sir, please.
Good evening. I have actually a question for both the doctors. Dr. Nadelmann, my question for you is, there was some talk about chaotic and uncontrolled use as kind of one end of the spectrum of substance use, and you talked about kind of self-determination. So it's kind of a philosophical question. Substance use doesn't just affect the person, it affects all the people in the other person's life. And how do you weigh that in when you try and design a policy? And for Dr. Wilson, my question to you again is about the chaotic and uncontrolled use. And you had mentioned that when people get to this state that they'll kill themselves. And you had talked about examples of animals. So if that's the case, how is criminalization going to reverse this process? And I'll give you 3 examples. First of all, SSI, which is a government disability, was at one point extended to people who had substance use, and that was removed. And to my estimation, to greater substance use and greater criminality. The second, you mentioned that controlled substances, people wouldn't go to get heroin, and yet we do have methadone programs that are legalized. I'm wondering what you think about that. Yeah, so those are the questions I'd like to respond to.
Methadone programs are extremely valuable, and controlling heroin use is one of the things where modern science has made extraordinary progress. Methadone doesn't solve the problem, but it stabilizes people and makes them available for verbal and clinical care, so this is a great advantage. It would be nice if such programs were available for cocaine and methamphetamine, but they're not.
But how is that different than heroin? Why would someone go to get methadone where they don't get high, and they would go to get heroin? Why would one be more effective?
Well, they go to get it for a combination of reasons. One is compulsion, that is to say, their wives, their family are abandoning them, or they fear the consequences of staying on the drug. And the alternative is criminal sanctions. So some combination of those external constraints make the consumption of methadone, though it doesn't confer a high, more attractive than heroin, which also doesn't confer a high. Really, it sort of wears you out.
Let me answer your question to me by bringing it in with the question you asked Jim here. You know, I believe that to some extent when we're trying to deal with drug addiction, especially addiction to opiates, but other drugs as well, we should think about it the same way we think about treating pain. Right? If somebody you love, or yourself, or somebody you love is in terrible pain, and you go to and they're in the doctor, and the doctor says to you, well, you know, we want to, you know, we're not sure whether you should give your mother morphine or maybe Demerol, you know, or Dilaudid, or do you care? And your answer is probably going to be, I don't care. You know, give her whatever's going to work best. Give her whatever's going to work best. And if they say, well, how about should we do it in an oral form, injectable form, a patient-controlled analgesic? We can do a lollipop with a fentanyl. You know, and you'll say, whatever's going to work best. I only really have 2 objectives here. First, I want you to take away her pain. And secondly, I want you to try to do whatever will help sustain her fundamental humanity. I think the same thing's true. When we're talking about people who've been addicted to illegal heroin, or for that matter, illegal methadone or OxyContin, oxycodone, I'll say, whatever's going to work. The Germans got 50,000 people on codeine maintenance. The French got 70,000 on buprenorphine maintenance. There are now thousands of people on diamorphine maintenance. That's the proper name for heroin maintenance. All working effectively, meeting these people's needs. I don't see why any one of those drugs or interventions is more or less immoral than the other. And so when you then ask me the question, well, what about the people who really can't control, the ones who really do lose control? Well, I think the third part of what I said, the third value is about responsibility. People do have to be held responsible to the extent that their actions actually do harm others. Use any drug for your own self without harming others. It's not the state's business. It's nobody else's business. Get behind the wheel of a car while under the influence. It is somebody's business. And when you're trying to deal with their out-of-control nature, we need to be far more innovative than we've been to date. That means not just the coerced drug treatment 12-step program with urine testing and the neat little sanctions that Jim's recommending. That also means being innovative about other ways to deal with people's addiction, the things we're seeing in harm reduction programs all around the world today. And it means being innovative with other types of drug treatments, maintenance treatments. There is now research going on in Texas and Houston, Australia and England about amphetamine maintenance, prescribing oral amphetamine for people addicted to injectable. There's almost no federal funding for that. There's an ideological resistance to providing people with drugs what are called agonist drugs rather than antagonist drugs, drugs that might mimic the effects of the drugs. Never mind drugs that might give people pleasure rather than pain.
Let's move on. Yeah. Next question, please.
My question is for Dr. Wilson. One of the premises of your argument was that legalization would result in prices falling precipitously and purity rising, which would in turn result with a 4 to 6-fold increase in the number of addicts. The government's own statistics during the course of the drug war, ONDCP statistics, show the prices of drugs falling precipitously, some as much as 80% cocaine, heroin, and purity rising 2, 3, 4, 5-fold. In that same time, per capita usage is flat.
Yes, because it's illegal.
So you think that's the sole? You think?
No, I don't think it's the whole story, but it's the one variable that you didn't mention. Drug prices have fallen, purity has gone up, but it is illegal. And most people are very responsive to whether a drug is legal or illegal. If you remove the illegality, then I think we would have to make a different calculation.
But Jim, in your own writings, you've talked about price and things affecting use under illegality in past decades. I mean, you can't now say it's staying flat because of illegality, but in the past when you talked about illegality, you did talk about changing price and such as being a key variable.
I don't know what writings you're referring to. I don't recall writing that down.
Sir.
Hello, my name is Edmund. I would like to thank the USF and the students and the moderator and both of you doctors for being here first of all. I went to the Million Medical Marijuana March in 2000 in Washington, D.C. And I would like to thank Dennis Kucinich for being a president candidate who really talks about this issue for all Americans. I have traveled 35 states, and everywhere I go, Americans need it, enjoy it, and sometimes I put in jail for it most. I think the time has come now where America must not just be wanted known for prisons, war,
Sir, do you have a
institution, and pharmacy. Yes,
I have a question.
What I'm saying is what I hear from Dr. Allen. He says all the great things that he know where we're at. But on Mr. Wilson, what I hear from you, you scare me. You know, it's like scaring the people. Like America Idol, they have anti-marijuana commercials every week, the anti-drugs, showing men and women won't walk their dog, and the dog go out and let the flag up. You know, it's stuff like that that's really corrupting America. And if we're going to ever be a great country, our Constitution, our Proclamation, the Bill of Rights, the flag was all made of hemp. And I'm also told in 1903 we had marijuana.
Sir, do you have a direct question to one of the debaters?
Let's get back to the earth. It's the people, the
next
land,
question,
the plant.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. Sir, next. Sir, please.
Hello,
Sir, your question, please. Sir, your question, please.
My question is addressed to Mr. Wilson, and in your speech you seem to agree with morality concerning Aristotle's view of moderation and pursuit of virtue, opposing that to John Stuart Mill's utilitarian point of view. And then you seem to contradict yourself when you said, we have now discovered this, we have now discovered the medical benefits of marijuana. So why are you seeming to hold upon a 2,000-year-old morality when you admit scientific, economic, and governmental progress in our modern society?
That's not what I said. What I said was that this culture, like every Western culture, is struggling to reconcile the libertarian views of Mill with the character building views of Aristotle, and we all arrive at different compromises. You can't embrace one strategy or the other. And I didn't say that I thought that Aristotle's view of the polis should be the view by which we govern 300 million people in this country. That is not my view. I was simply opposing these two theoretical traditions and trying to get people to see that for 2,000 years we have struggled to find a balance between them. And the balance we find varies from place to place. But it always, in every country in the world, has come down to saying that the truly dangerous drugs shall not be legal. I take the testimony of the countries who have adopted that position seriously. It's a rebuttable presumption. Someday somebody may prove that they were all wrong. But I take the wisdom of those decisions seriously, not because I embrace Aristotle, but because I think that this is the view that tries to reconcile two opposed opinions that has been the settling point for most experimentation.
So do you believe that there can ever be no progress, and at some point in our society we may look back on our times at present and say, wow, they were stupid for illegalizing drugs, when we can now know in a future time that those drugs are beneficial to society?
You've asked a question with so many conditional elements in it that I'm not sure what the focus of the question. Am I trying to guess what we will say in the future about the past?
No, I was just asking whether or not you believe there are any progress possible.
Oh, of course we've made progress. Before methadone, we made no progress on heroin at all. We sent people to a federal facility in Kentucky or ignored them. With methadone, we can now do something about it. This is progress. Possibly there'll be progress with other kinds of drugs. Until there is that progress, I don't think we should encourage its use.
Next question.
Just at first, I wanted to clarify. Did you say in your opening statement that methamphetamine had no medicinal value and led to only bad consequences?
That is my understanding. Do you believe differently?
Well, actually, methamphetamine is prescribed under the brand name Desoxyn
That's
for
true.
morbid obesity, attention deficit disorder, or narcolepsy.
That's true.
So I just wanted to say that it does have medicinal value, being that it is a Schedule II drug and is used as a medicine.
Yes, it is a Schedule II drug that does have some medical
I
use.
just
That's
wanted
right.
to clarify that. My actual question is for the pro-legalization side, and that was that an actual blanket legalization of all psychotropic drugs would in effect mean the legalization of not only heroin and cocaine, but Vicodin, oxycodone, SSRIs, Valium, any drug that actually affects the mind that are currently available by prescription.
Say that again. You're saying that legalization...
Blanket legalization of all psychotropic drugs would mean that drugs that are currently available only by prescription would be available over the counter. Now, my concern is that that would lead to increased incidence of people self-medicating, perhaps trying to save money on doctor visits or not being able to afford both doctor visits and the medicine. So in a scenario where all psychotropic drugs were legal, can you give a way that we could account for this problem?
When I was still teaching at Princeton in the early 90s, I pulled together a group of 18 academics from about a dozen disciplines, and we asked the question, what would be the optimal drug policy? And we started from two polar opposites. On the one hand, we took sort of the American model of drug prohibition, highly punitive, highly restrictive, very few legalization elements to it. On the other side, we took the Milton Friedman vision of this thing, right? And we then tried this intellectual exercise that went over many meetings of trying to stretch the two models towards one another to see if we could come up with some optimal model in the middle. You know, what if we began to decriminalize pieces of this, elevate public health, blah, blah, blah? What if we took the Friedman model and began to impose more time and place restrictions and all sorts of things like that, right? Because remember, the legalization model does not necessarily have to be an over-the-counter model, as we're seeing with prescription drugs or even the way pseudoephedrine is being handled today. And so we finally got into that middle, and we were torn about where we go. Nobody was a libertarian legalizer. Everybody was, against the drug war. And we said, look, we're trying to balance multiple needs. On the one hand, we want to respect individual freedom, but we also want to respect the rights of communities to manage what their public sphere is like. On the one hand, we want to put a stake through the heart of organized crime and their dominance of this thing. But on the other hand, we don't want to just have a free-for-all by totally eliminating all black market, making it all free. We tried to balance. Now, there was a model we came up with. It wasn't a proposal, but it was a model worth thinking about. And it said, if your objective is to balance public health, individual freedom, reduction of criminal justice, all of these things, what would be the simplest, easiest way to accomplish this? And the model we suggested, it's full of problems, I'll say it right up front, is what might be called the Vitamin House model or the mail order model, which was, imagine the following, that every adult in the United States has a right to possess whatever drug in small amounts for their own use. Imagine first that's a given right. Secondly, imagine that everybody has a right to have legal access to this drug. So we don't necessarily have Milton Friedman's right of selling it, but we have a right of access, a right to obtain it from some legally regulated, civilly liable source. What would be the minimal way to accomplish that? Well, imagine that you then had one Vitamin House. It could be in Kansas. It could be anywhere. And anybody could call, write, email, whatever, and have that drug delivered to their door, 24-hour delivery. Right? Now, if it's delivered in Mississippi, you may be in a place where there's no right of public sale, public consumption, what have you, but you still got that right in your private hotel room or your private home. If it's coming to San Francisco, you might have public sale and a lot of other things. Some places might allow advertising, other places ban it totally. But it would be a minimalist model that I think would undercut 90% of the criminal activity and 90% of the black market. It's one that would allow, and you could provide informational pieces to this so people needed to pass a little test about the dangers of any drug in order to get it first. But it seemed to me a model that might wipe out a lot of the problems with drug prohibition without inviting the problems we see today with the massive advertising and promotion of alcohol and cigarettes and prescription drugs. Is the model got tons of problems like child protection and this and that? Yes. Will there be people who will still persist with the black market like kids or people who can't wait 24 hours? Yes. Do I think people, homeless drug addicts, will figure out a way to make that system work for them? Yes, and that might be a positive thing. Will some people self-medicate rather than going to doctors? Yes, and that will be a bad thing sometimes and a good thing other times. So not a perfect model, but maybe it's the minimalist model for trying to change the system.
I appreciate the thoroughness of our debaters' responses, but let's be reminded of Cicero's maxim on brevity. Next question, please.
I have a question for Professor Nadelmann. Assuming that drugs were legalized, would you support stiffening penalties for people who actually do cause harm to others while on drugs as a way to deal with the increase in criminality from increased drug use?
Yes.
My question is for Dr. Wilson. Throughout your presentation to Dr. Nadelmann, you were very adamant about providing specific policy change proposals. And you also stated in several different parts of your presentation that you were not satisfied with the current way that the United States handles the problem of drug use. And at one point even mentioning your embarrassment over the rise of the percentage of state inmates incarcerated for drug offenses that, well, albeit they claim, but regardless. And my question to you is, what specific changes do you advocate in recognition of your dissatisfaction with the current program or whatever you want to say? What changes do you advocate to make it better?
I would, for those people who face prison because of the private possession or private consumption of drugs, I would put in place an alternative. And the alternative would be a program of probation in which they were not sent to prison on condition that they entered and stayed in a treatment program. And that enforcing that requirement to be in a treatment program would be done by small, administratively managed sanctions, such as I said earlier, perhaps a weekend in jail to make the point that having failed a drug test or having dropped out of a treatment program that was a condition of your probation, we're going to remind you very promptly, not by judicial action, but very promptly by the probation authorities, that you have to stay in. Now, how many people we would get out of prison by that strategy, I don't know, because we don't know how many people are in prison simply because of the private possession or consumption of drugs. But for those who are there for that reason, I would put in place a form of probation managed by drug courts or the probation authorities to try to encourage them to stay in treatment.
Next question. Thank you.
Mr. Wilson, you talk about the diversity of people's reactions to addictive drugs. Some users' lives are almost not affected, while others' lives are ruined. How does your policy of reducing the penalty for nonviolent drug use to like a one-weekend jail sentence for possession deal with the diversity of damage that drugs cause?
Deal with the diversity of damage that drug causes?
For example, your policy is a one-size-fits-all policy solution that's still grossly unfair to people who are nonviolent drug users.
No. My policy is for people whose difficulty is the private possession and consumption of drugs, is to induce them to get into a treatment program. The treatment program could range from Alcoholics Anonymous to Synanon to group homes to all manner of things. I don't believe one size fits all. I simply want to get them into a treatment program. And you can't get them into the treatment program if you say to them in advance, what you do in your private life is only your business. If you believe, as I do, that what you do in your private life can produce real harms for society, an inability to sustain a marriage, an inability to hold a job, an inability to get an education, then I want to get them in a treatment program. And my rules is not one size fits all. My rule is we want to induce you to get into and stay in a treatment program.
But if someone is able to control their abilities and control their activities, shouldn't they have the freedom to choose what they're going to do?
Yes, but they wouldn't come to the attention of the criminal justice system if they're in control of their facilities.
So you wouldn't inspect people for possession, like on the streets or something like that?
No,
or if they were
you
caught
wouldn't
for
go
another
searching the streets for people who are possessing an illegal substance.
Or
you would deal with people who present themselves to you as a consequence of having failed the normal tests of citizenship. They cannot function in society. And if you discover by tests that this is largely the result of a drug use, then you try to get them into a treatment program.
Ethan, a quick response.
Yeah, I mean, I fundamentally disagree with what Jim's saying. I think, first of all, that if you're using drugs in private or even in an appropriate public place and not causing any harm to anyone else, you shouldn't be a criminal. You shouldn't be treated by the state. And you don't need to be treated because there's nothing to be treated for. Drug use itself is not a treatable condition. It's when you have an addiction that you have a treatable condition. You know, so I think...
Ethan, that's not what I said. Try to quote me correctly.
Jim, I'm almost positive that's what you said. You
I
say if
said-
somebody is using drugs, then they should be put into a program. They should be, required to be drug tested.
No, I said people who present themselves to the criminal justice system
But Jim, this
as
is the
having
second-
failed the tests of
This
citizenship.
is the second problem you said. You said present themselves to the criminal justice system. In a world in which millions of Americans are being drug tested and deprived of access to school, jobs, cars, what have you, in the absence of any socially responsible, harmful behavior, becoming visible or seen by the criminal justice system becomes dramatically easier. In a world in which informants and people have all sorts of incentives for ratting out people and dropping a dime, even in the absence of harm, there are too many ways for people who are fundamentally innocent to become subjected to the criminal justice system, even in the absence of any harm to others. Where I would agree with you is if people are actually engaged in a behavior that is harmful to others, who deserve to be punished, who deserve jail or prison, I think it makes sense from a policy perspective, not necessarily a moral perspective, from a policy perspective, for a judge to consider that a treatment program might better serve the individual and society and even the victim than would prison. But I think that for people whose only offense is the use of drugs, I can't.
Let's clarify this, Chad. This is a terribly important point. When I said people present themselves as having failed the normal tests of citizenship, I did not mean that the criminal justice system would ignore all behavior save that which violates an existing criminal law, such as running over somebody with your car while under the influence of some intoxicating substance. I mean people who are like the people in the Skid Row of Los Angeles, who cannot sustain a family life, who cannot get an education, who cannot hold a job, and who are drifting on the streets. It seems to me to say that we will ignore people who are sleeping on the streets and being preyed upon by the predators who inhabit those streets because they're engaged in private consumption is a mistake. I think we ought to act on them and act on them in the way I described.
It sounds like you're coming close to embracing what I said before, which is that people
I hope
should not be. I think you are, Jim.
I hope
You're
not.
basically backing away and saying people shouldn't be punished absent some greater social harm. And then you're saying that these people are oftentimes mentally ill, have many problems. Drugs is both a cause and a consequence. They are being victimized and no doubt victimizing others. They are violating laws about sleeping on streets. Then you're saying those people, it becomes I think you're almost persuaded.
We're going to have time for two more questions.
Right now.
Two more questions.
Hi. Excuse me. My question was, I was wondering how you guys feel about testing for drugs in professional sports, like the use of steroids. And then my second question was how you guys feel about testing for marijuana in college sports in particular.
Thank you.
I'm in favor of testing for the use of performance-enhancing drugs in sports, because I think sports should pit a competition between people and not between chemical bottles. With respect to testing people for marijuana in college, are you college sports? Oh. Was the question about marijuana or steroids in college sports?
Marijuana.
No.
Yeah, I agree with Jim about marijuana. I mean, it was interesting when you had the that fellow in the Olympics, the skateboarder from Canada. Was that his name? Canada. He tested positive for marijuana, and the Olympic Oversight Committee had a dilemma. Were they going to ban marijuana because it was a performance-enhancing drug or because it was a performance-debilitating drug? Right?
Seriously, that man deserved another medal.
Well, yeah. Now, with respect to the, testing for performance-enhancing drugs, I don't know the answer to that. I think that as a matter of fairness, it would make sense to test for these drugs. I think that you don't want to have competition determined, as Jim said, by what chemical bottles you happen to have access to. I think the problem from a policy perspective is that more often than not, it seems that many of those tests simply are not working. What you hear from professional athletes and others, there's a wonderful piece by Malcolm Gladwell in the New Yorker some years ago about this issue, that inevitably people, especially at the higher levels, will find ways to treat. And what happens is that because people ultimately want to win, their objective is first to win, and typically second, not to harm their body long term, and second, not to get caught, and thirdly, not to undermine their body. The more rigorous that the testing is, the more likely athletes are to put avoidance of detection ahead of health concerns. So I think that as a moral matter, that testing might be a fair thing to do to keep things balanced. I think as a policy perspective, it may end up being ineffective and even counterproductive, but I'm not sure.
Ma'am, you'll have the final question.
This is a question for Dr. Wilson. There have been a number of cases here in the Bay Area recently where women who are medical cannabis patients have had their children taken away by Child Protective Services. Do you support Child Protective Services taking away the children of female medical marijuana patients?
I couldn't answer that question in general. Everything would depend on the condition of the particular parent.
It's a yes or no question, sir.
Pardon?
It's a yes or no question.
Pardon?
It's a yes or no question.
No, I don't give yes or no answers because you asked for a yes or no answer. I insist on knowing the condition of each woman. Some women may deserve to have their children taken away, and others, I am confident, do not. And I can't give you a yes or no answer to a categorical question.
Could you give me an example of where you think it would be appropriate for a woman to lose her children if she were a medical marijuana patient?
No. If she were truly a medical marijuana patient, no, I can't imagine the case in which that would be necessary. But the question is she truly a medical marijuana case? And you know the facts in San Francisco, I don't. So perhaps the cases you're referring to make clear that it was purely the medical use of marijuana. But I would look at each case to see whether, in addition to the medical use of marijuana, is the use of other drugs. I don't know the facts. If the facts are different, then the disposition has to be different. I really can't give a yes or no answer to a question I don't know the facts about.
Thank you. Again, ladies and gentlemen, thank you.